want to know what you're fighting for. Podcast for George. 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 Oh, yeah.
Hello. Hi. How are you? Welcome back to another podcast by George. Well, not a lot of time, just time well spent. I mentioned that on the podcast last time. And it's time well spent today. We don't have a lot of time, but it's Matthew Hoh back on Podcast by George. In this bio, I got to read it. Matthew Hoh has nearly 12 years' experience with America's wars overseas with the United States Marine Corps, Department of Defense, and State Department. Matt's been a senior fellow with the Center for International Policy since 2010. In 2009, Matthew resigned his post in protest in Afghanistan with the State Department over the American escalation of the war. And anybody that was watching cable news back then saw him all over the television. I mean, that was big news when they used to cover stuff like that. They don't hardly at all anymore, and that's going to be a little bit of what we're talking about today. Prior to his assignment in Afghanistan, Matthew took part in the American occupation of Iraq, first in 04-05, then 06-07 in Anbar Province as a Marine Corps company commander. And when not deployed, Matthew worked on Afghanistan and Iraq war policy and operations issues at the Pentagon and State Department from 02-08. Now, in 2010, Matthew was awarded the Withdrawal Prize for truth-telling, and in 2020, he was awarded Defender of Liberty by the Committee for the Republic. He's a 100% disabled veteran. He's been certified by the North Carolina state as a peer support specialist for mental health and substance use disorder. God, I love that bio. Matt, welcome back to a podcast by George.
I say it every time, George, but I need to give you a shorter bio.
Oh man, I love reading that. Out of all the bios I read, I mean, I really like that one the best. I mean, my God, you talk about bona fides, whatever you want to call it. That stuff's great. Well, let's get to this article. I want to bring this up on screen here for folks that may not have seen it. Let me see. So this is from the CNN's website. Now, the title of this is What Critics of the U.S. Withdrawal from Afghanistan Get Wrong. And it reads the opening paragraph here. Within hours of President Joe Biden's announcement that U.S. forces will leave Afghanistan by September 11th, 2021. God, I hate it ties into that date. I don't know, that just bugs me. Objections and remonstrations appeared across U.S. media. These protests are nearly all disingenuous, false, and specious, and meant to utilize fear to continue a tragic and purposeless war. I gotta admit here, Matt, right off the top, I was surprised to see that on CNN because I gotta tell you something, folks, they fall into that criticism, into that category a lot. Matt, were you surprised at all that they published that?
I'm part of an organization called the Eisenhower Media Network, and we've got some big money behind us. Some people who have a lot of money, and that has enabled us to hire 2 full-time bookers, social media people, communications people, whatever you want to call them. But that's what you need to get into a lot of these pages. It's very different than it was 10 years ago, as you alluded to in your introduction, completely different than it was 20 years ago, and it's unfathomable, I guess, compared to 30 years ago, when I first started reading the New York Times or when I was in college. So you need that type of professional presence in order to secure a spot in most of the major media. If you do something that's noteworthy or unique, or you're kind of the news item of the day, that's a different story. But if you are a run-of-the-mill expert, if you will, to get into a major publication, you need some help. And for me, because of my disability, I hadn't been doing a lot for a bunch of years, so I lost a lot of my contacts. So that's why these last several years, as I've tried to get back into doing this kind of work, I've not been able to get into major publications as I could, because the people I used to work with at those places have just simply moved on. So now with this Eisenhower Media Network, having that money behind us has really helped. We've had a number of people get into spots on MSNBC, on Fox News, on in the USA Today, Wall Street Journal, other places like that. The what we call mainstream media. trying to reach people who don't hear this type of information, who don't normally hear these voices.
And I'll tell people on my podcast, it goes even deeper than the guests that they bring on, although that has got a lot to do with it. On CNN, Wolf Blitzer, everybody knows Wolf Blitzer. Guy worked for AIPAC. I mean, I'm tuning in last week and he's telling me about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, for God's sake. I mean, that's where Wolf Blitzer came from. Okay, flip it over to MSNBC. John Brennan's on the set. Jim Clapper and those guys. I mean, they're like, they're not hosts, but I mean, they're hired help on MSNBC. Anderson Cooper on 60 Minutes, for God's sake. I think he's a CNN guy too. Hey, he's from the CIA. That's where he worked. I mean, people just have no idea what's going on. And then we ran through these Iowa caucuses and the last run up for the presidential election. Pete Buttigieg won, quote unquote, the Iowa caucuses. The guy's from Navy intelligence. He worked for the McKinsey Group. You know, he's deep secret stuff. He can't tell you anything about his background or who he worked for or what he did or anything like that. My God, you're not going to nominate somebody like that in the Democratic Party for president, are you? Well, Iowans chose him for the caucus. And then, of course, we pick old Uncle Joe Biden, the guy mostly responsible for every war that we've been in on the Democratic side anyway, for the last 20, 30 years. Including the Iraq War. Well, let me bring this up because I want to bring up another article here because this goes really to what you were talking about in the CNN piece. That appeared last week. Here, just in the past couple days, I found this. Okay, this is from the Associated Press, and I have the Associated Press on, quite a bit here. I quote their articles. Dateline Washington, D.C., when he pulled the plug on the American war in Afghanistan, President Joe Biden said the reasons for staying 10 years after the death of al-Qaeda leader Osama bin Laden had become increasingly unclear. Now that a final departure is in sight, questions about clarity have shifted to Biden's post-withdrawal plan. What would the United States do, for example, if the Taliban took advantage of the U.S. military departure by seizing power? Okay, let's stop right there because it didn't take me very long, just being a guy in the Midwest. I'm looking at that and saying, oh, okay, well, the Taliban seizing power in Afghanistan, were they ever out of power? That's their home turf. I don't know, Matt. Answer that question for that guy.
They were out of power briefly for a couple years. So we invade in 2001. And one of the things that you see with the government influence is there are certain unwritten rules about how you're going to report on these wars if you want to get the sources, if you want to have the access. So you see Robert Burns, who has been with AP for, ever, but he still follows those rules. So he will not call what's happening in Afghanistan right now a civil war. If you go back and you look at the reporting done in Afghanistan up until the U.S. enters the war directly in 2001, nearly everyone describes it as a civil war. As soon as the U.S. becomes involved, that talk of civil war goes away. Right? It has been a civil war. The same was the case in Iraq, where the idea of calling what was happening there a civil war, even though it was clear that various sects were killing each other. And a lot of that had to do with the United States government's policy of divide and conquer, basically. The media was still very shy to use the term civil war. And in Afghanistan in the last 10, 15 years, it's been even more strict. So there's these unwritten rules that kind of exist that you follow the U.S. government's lead on what to call things. And if the U.S. government doesn't want to call a civil war, because that causes all kinds of problems, right? Because, oh my God, the United States is involved in someone else's civil war. Everybody in the United States themselves will say, oh, we got to stay out of this. What's it got to do with us, et cetera, et cetera. So you use different terms for it. You don't say, you call it an insurgency, or you call them extremists, or you call them terrorists, but you don't give any validity to the idea that the United States is mired in someone else's civil war, which is basically what we have been for, we had a great hand in starting this. This goes back to before the Soviets invade, goes back to the 1970s to really to 1973. But so there's all these rules, that the media tend to follow because they're so afraid of losing access, because that's, as well then too having having John Brennan's or Michael Hayden or these people sign on to your network afterwards or become contributors. But yeah, the question about the Taliban, they were out of power briefly in 2001. And they actually offered to work with the U.S. and the new Afghan government, and the United States, because of the people we put in power in Afghanistan in 2001, wanted nothing to do with that. They want a complete victory. The United States wanted a complete victory. We put back into power the very warlords that the Taliban had kicked out of power. And when the Taliban kicked those people out of power, the people of Afghanistan saw the Taliban as liberators. Now, what happened was the Taliban were just as bad as the people they kicked out of power. So the people in Afghanistan got pretty tired of the Taliban pretty quickly. But, you know, I mean, it has been the Taliban starting in 2004, 2005, because of the viciousness of these warlords. And because it was a civil war, and much of what's been occurring in Afghanistan, particularly since the 90s, even before then, has been based on ethnicity, so different ethnic groups fighting each other in many ways, or different tribes or different localities fighting each other. It gets kind of complicated. But so I mean, the Taliban start coming back over from Pakistan in 2005. And it's not so much like they're invading back over from Pakistan, but it's more like the people of southern and eastern Afghanistan are pulling them back in because they're a better alternative than these warlords that the United States has put back into power. You know, it reminds me of, what did they say about Somoza in Cuba? Was it? You know, he may be a son of a bitch, but he's our son of a bitch.
Yeah, right.
Right. You know, I mean, so it's like that kind of thing where, look, these guys, if you're going to make me choose between these warlords and the Taliban, well, at least the Taliban are from our local area. They are Pashtun. They represent us in that sense. You know, they may be awful, but at least they're part of us. They're not outsiders. It very much as if, like, the United States after Hurricane Katrina had, you know, brought the New York National Guard or the Illinois National Guard and had them occupy wards of Louisiana. Right. You mean outsiders coming in? Even it's even more extreme than that. But I think people get the gif. But the truth is, yeah, the Taliban have never really left. They've controlled areas. They control large parts of the country. I mean, I don't think there's any real good statistic. I could tell you that when I was there in 2009, areas that we claimed, that the United States claimed it controlled, the Afghan government controlled, we didn't. What you would go to these small outposts, and supposedly the United States claimed the whole district. And district is kind of like a county, basically, and a province is kind of like a state. Think of it that way. And we would claim that we had the whole province under control. And you'd ask this young Army lieutenant or Army captain, what did he control? And he said, about as far as my machine guns can reach. That's all I can control. Okay. And that was in 2009. And it's been that way. So the Taliban have controlled large parts of Afghanistan for most of the last 20 years. And now, you know, it's just becoming more apparent what their reach is. What you've seen a lot of the fighting, I think, for people to understand just how awful this is, and when ask, why are we doing this, is a lot of the fighting, the fierce fighting that's occurring and has been occurring over the last several years, has been for possession of the opium fields, the poppy fields. So some of that really fierce fighting you hear about in southern Afghanistan, that is really between the Afghan government and the Taliban and various warlords. And, you know, it's not, there's not like two sides, you know, blue versus red here. It's very difficult sometimes to understand it. But yeah, for control of the opium fields, though, for the poppy fields. I mean, so that's another part of this, is that so much of this fighting is just about who's going to control the drug trade in Afghanistan. And that's what the United States has been in. And I think people can remember back to 10 years or so ago when we had the surge, Obama's surge in Afghanistan. You had video and pictures of American soldiers and Marines guarding poppy fields. Yeah. And let's not forget that those drugs, just as the Afghanistan went from producing 0% of world's illicit opium in 2001 to 85 or 90% now, we've had awful opioid epidemic in this country, right? Over the last 10 years, we've had 80,000, 90,000 people dying every year from overdoses. You know, where do you think that heroin?
What a coincidence. Yeah. Funny how that works. Well,
right.
Again, we're limited on time, so I'm going to turn these things into like quick hitters. Let me bring a couple of these things up. So here's this article again, and just look at the black headers here, and we'll just whip through these. What happens after the troops are gone? Well, of course, this would be for military planners, something that ought to be thought of beforehand and certainly during. But what's your response to that, Matt? What's going to happen? What do you think? What's your prognostication after the remaining U.S. troops are gone? And again, maybe you can talk also about the fact we're not going to leave entirely, perhaps.
Yeah, we're not going to leave entirely. The United States will keep special operations and CIA personnel there. The CIA runs their own. The CIA has its own army in Afghanistan, completely off the books. It's Afghans, so those people aren't going anywhere. But estimates are that it's about a 10,000 man army, and they are incredibly gross human rights violators, as people would expect, right? So think of the Operation Phoenix program during Vietnam or whatever. As well as too, we have all our aircraft and our drones in the area. A lot of people don't realize that a lot of the aircraft that work over Afghanistan aren't based in Afghanistan. They come from bases in the Persian Gulf. They come from aircraft carriers. The drones come from secret bases. I mean, we used to have secret drone bases in Pakistan, of all places, right? I mean, so, as well then too, we've got all these ships at sea that have hundreds of cruise missiles as well. What will happen with we've got 3,500 U.S. troops there, 18,000 contractors. What happens to these contractors? In Iraq, what happened was a lot of them just switched over to the Iraqi government paying them, as opposed to the U.S. government paying them. But the U.S. government was giving the money to Iraq to pay it, right? I mean, so you're just basically creating a middleman. So, but what happens, I'm sure I've said this before because I love saying it with the Yogi Berra quote about predictions is, predictions are hard, especially when they're about the future, right? But it's going to be terrible, and that's why it's going to be terrible regardless of what happens. If the U.S. stays, it's going to be terrible. And if the U.S. stays, there's no end at all. I mean, foreign forces have to leave for this war to end. It's very clear that's one. I mean, so what's so important is there for be negotiations, for there be efforts by the U.S. and a bunch of other nations to make sure these negotiations go forward. You need to use a carrot and stick approach, right? Because the Afghan government doesn't want to really negotiate and give up power because they've got power, right? So they're on the gravy train right now. They're getting billions of dollars from the U.S. every year. The U.S. is keeping them in power. So what incentive does the Afghan government have to negotiate? So you have to maybe withhold money from them. I mean, do different things as well, too. The Taliban recognize they've already been booted from power once by the United States. They know the United States can do it again. I mean, look what happened to Islamic State in eastern Syria and western and northern Iraq. And the Taliban know if they take over Kabul in that way, right, just as the Islamic State took over Mosul in 2014, Kabul will look like Mosul does now. It'll be completely leveled by the U.S. Air Force and the U.S. Navy. So they know they're not stupid. They want power, but they're not suicidal or apocalyptic. So the answer to that is that it will be it will look like the same with the fighting, unless really concerted efforts are done to ensure that some kind of peace settlement comes forward. Chief among that is everybody, the U.S. included, stop sending weapons and money into the war to keep it going. That's the most important thing.
Okay, so the next question that he has, will the Taliban enlist or assist Al-Qaeda? And, of course, this is confusing. And I remember Tulsi Gabbard bringing that up at one of the presidential debates with that Tim Ryan kind of dunked on him a little bit, this connection Al-Qaeda and the Taliban. What's your response to that?
This is one of my favorite things to explain to people. So every year the United Nations puts out this report on the links between Al-Qaeda and the Taliban. If you read the report, what you come to realize is that the people who are supplying the information about the links between Al-Qaeda and Taliban is the Afghan Intelligence Service itself, the NDS, the National Director of Security. National Director of Security is a CIA. They're the CIA's organization. So what you're getting is the very people who are in the NDS. They torture everybody they get their hands on. The people of Afghanistan hate the NDS. If anybody does not want to lose power, it's the NDS. So, of course, what you have is the NDS saying, look, the Al-Qaeda and the Taliban are still together. They're still working together. And that's what the Pentagon is referring to whenever the Pentagon says, or Congress or whoever says that there's still links, or they were referencing back to this United Nations report that comes from the NDS. The NDS, again, who has every reason in the world to say there's a link between Al-Qaeda and the Taliban. The reality is that there's not much of a link. It's very tenuous. Even the relationship between Al-Qaeda and the Taliban in 2001 was incredibly strained. The Taliban offered to hand over bin Laden in 1998 after the embassy bombings in Africa to the U.S., and the U.S. didn't want anything to do with that. And then we launched cruise missiles into Afghanistan, killed a lot of people, and then in 2001, the Taliban, have been upset about that, of course. So what they said, rather than hand over bin Laden to the U.S., we will hand over bin Laden to a third country. And they were saying this up until the time the United States was bombing it. And George Bush said, absolutely not, no negotiations or whatever. And here we are because of that. Right. So, and there's all kinds of other things we can get into about how those links really don't exist. But, for 15 years now, the United States has been saying there's fewer than 100 Al-Qaeda terrorists in Afghanistan, and there hardly isn't even any of that probably. And it's the same 100 guys. I mean, and we've spent $1 trillion trying to kill 100 Al-Qaeda people. I mean, it's ridiculous. And every chance Taliban get to deny their links to Al-Qaeda, they do. They've been doing this they were renouncing their links to Al-Qaeda when I was there. I mean, it's just something, it's a really bad, this is a really bad indication, Tom. We're talking about how the media doesn't do its own work, about how it doesn't, it's very clearly they've been renounced. I mean, they have their own English language news service, the Taliban. They tweet out in English, their spokesperson. I mean, like they've been saying this, and they just, our media continues, and then they don't even look into like, okay, well, who's saying that there's links between, it's the NDS. Of course they're saying that. So yeah, I mean, it's you wonder, why do these wars keep going like this? And there's an example, because in a lot of ways the media just isn't doing its job.
Well, Let me bring up the next question here, because we are running out of time. And we talked about the special forces and the connections there that are going to be behind. This one kind of struck me. The administration said it will retain a U.S. embassy presence, but that will become more difficult if the military's departure leads to a collapse of Afghan governance. Millie's there talking about this diplomacy difficulty that we're going to have. Well, I don't know. I just look at something like that, man. I think, my God, when we're talking about death and destruction, war and mayhem and everything that's been going on there, this horrible history in Afghanistan, and we're talking about it could make diplomacy more difficult. I mean, is that really a top concern or not?
It's in 1979, the U.S. ambassador to Afghanistan was kidnapped, and he was killed. They tried to rescue him. The Afghans tried to rescue him. He was killed, I guess, in the rescue attempt. But the very people who kidnapped him, these Islamic groups, we were already giving money to them to overthrow the Afghan government. And after they killed our ambassador, we just kept giving them money. Yeah, I mean, this goes back, the idiocy of this goes back through so many administrations, George. I mean, through generations of us now at this point. Diplomacy will work based upon what our intentions are. It's just as simple as that. If our intentions are to really bring about a ceasefire and that will then lead into a lasting peace, it will only work if that's what our true intentions are. If our intentions are to somehow continue to prop up this corrupt, fraudulent government there, but have a charade of peace about it, that's not going to work. If our attempt is to basically could be to manipulate the Taliban and turn them to work for us, again, it's not going to work. It's only going to work if our intentions actually are to create peace and stability in Afghanistan. I mean, in the history of this in Afghanistan is even after the Soviet Union leaves, the United States keeps sending money. Everyone, the whole Charlie Wilson thing about how at the end of that movie, he said, they talk about how the United States is going to abandon Afghanistan, which is completely not true. The United States kept funding. Soviet Union leaves in 1989. In 1992, the United States and Saudi Arabia were still sending $400 million every year to the Afghan Mujahideen, to the very worst of these Islamist groups, right? And at that point, the civil war was raging. I mean, they were shelling Kabul. Tens of thousands of people were dying, and the United States was still sending hundreds of millions of dollars to these groups. Jim Baker, who was George H.W. Bush's Secretary of State, he famously said about after the Soviet Union left about the negotiations is that, to paraphrase, he said, "We're not interested in peace. We're not interested in free elections. We're interested in victory." And I mean, and if that's what the intention is, then you're only going to get more war. That's all I can say about the diplomacy and about any effort by the Biden administration going forward. It's all about what their actual intention is.
Well, we're out of time for this episode. God, it goes by fast. I guess you can take us out with this comment. We started off talking about the complicit role of the media in this. And as you mentioned, it has to do with access. These reporters want to continue to have that earpiece, to the CIA and the FBI and the Defense Department, obviously. There are some people that believe that at this juncture, maybe you could look at it and say that they're too dumb, or they want the access, or maybe they're in on it. Have you gone that far yet? Do you think that, like in an article like this, where all of these questions are put out there and they're all unanswered and they're all going to these establishment Defense Department sources to get their perspective on it, but they're not coming to anybody else to get a contrary point of view, to someone like you? I mean, it's kind of hard to say that they're not in on it to a certain extent.
Oh, they totally are. It's totally complicit. The idea of like the adversarial. What's the line about journalism, George? You're supposed to comfort the afflicted and afflict the comfortable.
Yes,
I mean, right. They all go to the same cocktail parties. They all they're friends basically. You get into the macro aspects about this, the economic aspects about this. Paul Jay does really great stuff on this, but the same 5 or 6 money management firms, BlackRock, State Street, Vanguard, these massive money management firms, trillions and trillions of dollars of value to them, they own 95% of the S&P. So the same 5 banks that own the media companies also own the defense industry and also own the fossil fuel industry and own, on and on and on. So there's a connection there that they are going to be very upset if something's going to upset their profits. So you don't get the reporting on the wars. I think there comes from like a top-down board of directors level kind of decision that, and everybody who's worked in organizations know that there doesn't have to be stuff written down in the organizational guidebook for it to be a rule. There's a lot of unspoken things, but you have just the access. And I saw it firsthand in 2009, 2010. I saw it very clearly. Martha Raddatz at ABC News, friend of mine who worked over there, was trying to get her to interview me, and basically ABC was told by the Pentagon, if you interview him, you will not be invited on the next trip to Afghanistan with General McChrystal. Same thing happened with Dan Rather. I mean, have I ever told you the Dan Rather story?
Tell me.
Oh, I was up in, so Dan Rather, this was late 2009. Dan Rather was hosting his own show on, I don't know, National Geographic Channel or some channel on Smithsonian Channel or whatever, some channel on cable, hour-long weekly news thing or whatever. And they bring me up to New York. I film with Dan Rather for about 3 hours, probably, or 2 hours at least. And, he's very encouraging. He says to me, I know you're right about this because I've been going to Afghanistan for 3 decades now. And then right as we're wrapping up, his producer comes out and he says, just got this email. How do you want me to, should we ask you about it? And I said, whatever you want to do. And the email basically was from, it wasn't from the Pentagon per se. It was from a strategic communications company. And it basically said, Matthew Hoh is not who he says he is. He is misrepresenting himself. He never saw the things he's claiming to say. He had like a little job where he wasn't very important. We're not even really sure why he signed up to go. All this kind of stuff. And basically, you read through the lines too, because it basically said if you basically if you're the type of, it basically kind of said if you're the type of journalist who want to interview somebody like this, there's no reason for us to have to work with you.
Wow.
Right. So, I'm sorry, for the dog, but like, Lily, what happens is, a month or two later, or a couple months later, the show airs, right? And I'm nowhere to be seen on the show, but where is Dan Rather? Dan Rather's in Afghanistan with General McChrystal, and all that. And it culminates all this. And then, a Wikipedia page appears about me that's got all kinds of like stuff incorrect or half true or lies about me. And basically this Wikipedia page implied that I had gone to Afghanistan just so I could resign and protest, so I could become like a media celebrity. I mean, it was just so obscene and so unreal. But that's it. And so it culminates, though, George, with I'm at a Christmas party, and this guy comes up to me, and he says, "Hey, he introduces himself to me," and I say, "Nice to meet you, Duncan." And he says, "Yeah, I just want to introduce myself because I run." And I forget at this point the name of the strategic communications company, which they did all the strategic communications for Central Command, who oversees all the wars in the Middle East, United States. And that was General Petraeus's command at that point. And he said, I just want to introduce myself because I'm the one who's been personally discrediting you to all the media. Guy came up to me and said that right to me at a Christmas party.
Wow.
You're right. I mean, like, that's what you're dealing with. General Petraeus wrote his thesis on the Pentagon and the media during Vietnam when he got his doctorate for Princeton. I mean, the U.S. military has come to understand that it just doesn't make sense to work with the press, but to co-opt them, to make them complicit, to basically own them, to deny them access and I saw it firsthand. I mean, it was. Yeah, it really was. And it continued to happen, where no matter where I went on, the producer would get a thing afterwards saying like, demeaning me. I mean, libeling me, basically saying like Matthew Hoh, he didn't do this, but he's saying I was making stuff up, all kinds of, where just enough where if you weren't a seasoned producer, if you didn't have guts behind you, whatever, you might not feel it's worth to book someone like me again in the future because you don't want to deal with that hassle. You don't want to risk having someone, or maybe it is true. Maybe this guy is making it up, right? Or at the very least, they're basically telling you like, look, if you're going to book someone like this, we're not going to go on your show anymore. So now you're not going to have the generals. Now you're not going to have the ex-CIA spy chiefs, people who lie as a living. Right. I mean, so, yeah, they're in on it. And I have a 1,000 other stories like that, too.
My God. Well, we'll get to some of those as we come back and revisit the PBG. When I hear that story, again, I don't know, I talked about Tulsi Gabbard a little bit earlier, but here you are, a Marine Company commander over there serving in Afghanistan. For the State Department, you've devoted your life to this now. You've got that Ridenour Prize for truth-telling, and these people are doing this to you. Like Tulsi Gabbard, my God, she's currently in the military. She's an angel of mercy. She's a medic, for God's sake. She devoted her entire life to public service, and Hillary Clinton sits down on a podcast and calls her a Russian asset. I mean, my God, what we do to people in this country is unbelievable.
What's so bothersome is that people don't see right through that, right?
I know, and it is. And you bring it up, and it's just dust that's in the air that they keep throwing up. And this article that we went through is just one of those examples. Well, we got to leave it there. I got to run. I got to get you out of here. I mean, my God, we're way over time. But sometime I'm going to do a podcast that's 3 hours long, and we'll do a Joe Rogan version here.
Oh, that'd be cool. I'd like that.
We'll just go. We'll just
really
get
cool.
after it, folks. That's Matthew Hoh. Matt, thanks for coming back on a podcast by George.
Thank you, George.
Yeah, we got to run. God, this has been great. I hate to cut it off, but we got to do it. And I want to tell everybody now, if you like Podcast by George, if you like this kind of insight and perspective, if you like learning like this, and you're watching on YouTube, like us there, subscribe to the podcast, leave a comment. All of those things make it possible for more people to watch it on YouTube. And of course, our big platform always has, maybe always will be, Facebook. Like us there, and thanks for listening on iTunes and the iHeartRadio app and places where podcasts are heard. But that's going to do it. That's going to wrap it up. That's all there is, and there ain't no more. That's another podcast by George.